at that time, as I just said, we were flatting, so we spent our year at the hostel, and we ended up with 6 physio students living on the ground floor of a flat. King's College was a big training hospital. The next floor up from us was 6 medical students, and on the top floor of our house there were 6 nurses. I have to say that you can't discount the social life of a hospital. Back then, really a lot of the stuff that we did revolved around the whole of the social things that went on at the hospital. And I have to say, if it wasn't for the social things at the hospital, I wouldn't have met my husband, because he and his friend were from New Zealand, met up with some of the medical students playing rugby, because guys from New Zealand, I think they probably all sold themselves as just about missing the All Blacks. So they got to play rugby for King's rugby team, met up at a social flat. We seemed to have parties quite often at the flats, one group or other, in those days. And I met my future husband there, and eventually came back to New Zealand with him after we got married. So, the social side of living in London in the late 60s, even though I've been in New Zealand now longer than I ever lived in England, when we've been back, London just has a magic for me that I just can't forget. And when the first time we went back to England was after 30 years being in New Zealand, and it just so happened that my eldest son was living in Brixton, which was a sort of one of the places we would go to. And I can remember one day Peter and I walked from Brixton, and we walked back along Cold Harbour Lane and up past King's and up Denmark Hill and around the park at Herne Hill. It was quite nostalgic. King's looked very different. It's very new now, and some of the places that we used to hang around back then, particularly there was a small house outside the back of King's that everybody would go to for lunch. It was named after the lady who owned it. It might have been M's or something like that, and you'd go in through the front door and they'd have this set up in the first room. There was sausage rolls, and you could buy pieces of cheese and tomatoes, and you could buy all these things, and then all the rest of the house was just set up with old armchairs and everything, and everybody would just go there for their lunches. And I still remember those pieces of cheese, and the sausage rolls I don't think I've ever had a sausage roll like she used to sell there, but that had all gone because King's is now extended and there's lots of new buildings around there. I suppose the 3 years that I spent training did give me some friendships that have lasted. Extraordinarily, I met one of the people I shared, and back then you didn't have your own rooms like they have the luxury of these days in hostels. 3 of us shared a bedroom at the hostel. I'm going back in time again now, but I found myself sharing a room with a physiotherapy student who, if I'd stayed in Buxton, or if my family had stayed in Buxton, we would have been at the same primary school together. It was just extraordinary, and Barbara and I are still friends. They've been to visit us and we've been to visit them when we've been back to the UK. And recently another friend that I trained with, they came out to New Zealand and she's still in physiotherapy. It's an interesting profession that I think has challenged those that I've known who I trained with. They had a reunion a few years ago. Most of them were still a group of physios who were still practising in one way or other, and a whole range of skills that we would never have dreamed in the late 60s that we would be doing. I would never have thought I would be in education. But having said that, I must say Miss Jepson said to me that she thought I should teach. And I've thought about that since, and I always thought she meant teach as she was teaching in a school of physiotherapy. But what I do, working in education now and with physiotherapy, I teach every day. But then I've also reflected that in actual fact physios are teachers the whole time, because if you didn't teach you could never get people to do the things that they need to do. Whatever role our profession is, and you're a teacher is first and foremost. It's one of the skills we've got that perhaps isn't promoted very much in our training, but I think we all have to be able to do it. And maybe that's where some of our background is, and maybe that's why this appealed to me as a profession. I wanted to be a phys ed teacher, and I couldn't do that, but I think what I've done is something very similar.